Right.
Okay, well, let's call the meeting to order. Can we do a roll call?
Councilmember Ledford,
Here.
Councilmember Week,
Here.
Councilmember Whitmer,
Here.
Vice Chair Lewis,
Here.
Mayor DeGolia.
Here. And the first item on the agenda today is the issue of library funding. And I'll pass it over to Samantha. Public comments. Any public comments on issues on the agenda? Okay, no public comments. Yes, please.
Why isn't there has to be almost half of the stuff in the library? There are other projects in the city, like the closed video thing, like your house, or the city. Why can't the closed video
We can address that as a presentation.
Yeah, we'll definitely address that. There's a set of slides. Let's go through the slides and then please come back to the issue if it's not answered.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The intent of today's presentation on the library, as you know, the mayor is the council's representative on the library JPA, and I think the vice mayor is the alternate for that. And lately, the JPA governing board has developed a donor fund subcommittee to look at the issue of library donor funds, of which Atherton is a recipient of those funds, because they're raised locally and it costs less to operate a library than what's raised. So they're looking at revising the JPA to address the donor fund issue, and the mayor has been engaged in working with them to work out what that option might look like. And the town, as you know, has a number of options. So we're going to go through a little bit of history for the public that's in attendance. We've done blogs and e-news information out to the community as well. Talk just briefly on the joint powers agreement and proposed revisions to the agreement, or at least a lookout for that in the use of excess funds. So the San Mateo County Free Library System started in 1912, and the property tax-based library tax is 3.2 cents for every $100 of assessed valuation. And it's a county tax based on state taxing for library services, and it can only be spent under state law on library services. So if it's related to the library, it can be spent on. If it's not related to the library, we can't use library revenue for that. The library tax existed before the formation of the library JPA, and the JPA itself, which is 11 member agencies plus the county, was formed in 1999. The residents currently pay an annual library tax of $2.3 million. That's what's raised locally in Atherton. The cost to operate our library at its current level is about $1.1 million, including county overhead, because services are provided through the county. There's some overhead associated with that. Excess funds, as I mentioned, is local tax revenue in excess of the cost to operate our library. And those are placed into a donor fund to be spent within the local jurisdiction where those funds are collected. So money's collected in Atherton of that $2.3 million. They have to stay in our library for our library services. That's the only place they can be spent. That donor fund provision is a function of the JPA agreement that was entered into in 1999. And there's only 3 communities of those 11 communities that are in the donor fund situation. It's Atherton, Woodside, and Portola Valley. Portola Valley, they accumulate about $100,000 a year into their donor fund. Woodside's more along 400,000 or so, 450 to 500,000 a year going into their donor fund. Atherton is at a rate of 1.3 million a year going into our donor fund. And as I mentioned, those can only be spent on library services under state law. We've been accumulating those excess funds since the formation of the JPA and the creation of the donor fund. And we've been using them to maintain our existing library, provide custodial and landscaping services, to purchase library supplies. And the JPA sets out that any community that has a population of 10,000 or less, the minimum level of library services within the JPA cities is 40 hours per week. Our library operates at 57. We're using donor funds to do that offset. If you are more than a 10,000 population city, the JPA says your library should operate at 60 hours per week. So right now, we've got between our trust fund and the county's trust fund, $8.6 million of excess donor funds. And right now, all of that, plus the next year to 2 years, is going to be used to design and construct our new library. Yeah, that slide's just a brief look at the funding history. So in fiscal year 10, revenue 1.9 million, expense of about $1 million, excess funds are along the bottom. We're putting in about $900K a year for a while, and then in fiscal year 13, it starts to jump up to 1.1 million, and in fiscal year 14 jumps up to 1.3 million. So we expect that amount to continue to accumulate. The increased trend may not be as steep because there's Prop 8 and property tax issues going on. But it will still accumulate at that rate, at least for the next couple of years, as we finish out our design and construction of the library. So the estimated new design and construction cost for our library is about $9.8 million. That was part of the master plan, and that proposed a proposed library of about 9,000 square feet that came out of the Civic Center Advisory Committee. $2.5 million could be included for renovation of the historic council chambers, where half the room was probably out about a half hour ago looking for this meeting, as the new library community room. So in total, that's about $12.3 million. The estimated new library operational costs, right now it's about $1.1 million to operate. I took a swag number in there and put $250K. We're looking at going from a library of 4,790 square feet to a library of 9,000 square feet. Just basic operational costs, county overhead, staffing, hours, books, supplies, materials, another $250K. That doesn't address expanded or enhanced programs and services that we could look at with that new library system. We've got larger community rooms, we can have bigger meetings, we can have more programs, we can have more services. Those sorts of things aren't factored into that $250K. That's just basic operation. So that's about $1.35 million a year. Estimated library accumulation excess funds after the new library is operational is about $1 million a year. So we'll still be accumulating that excess donor fund even after we've opened the new library and had the basic operational services going on. Again, that's not enhanced services, just basic services.
So how did you get that number? Look at the number of this chart. It says the expenses are $11 million a year. We're adding $4. It should be about
That's great. That's about 1.35, so it's about 50K left. So that JPA funding agreement, the JPA agreement, is basically where it all comes down to the wire. What's the town going to do as we move forward after we built our library? We're still accumulating excess funds. What are we going to do with those funds? We have to go all the way back to the JPA agreement to at least outline what that looks like and what our options are there. The JPA, like I said, is 11 members plus the county. The agreement itself, which is the position we're in now, can be modified by a 2/3 vote of the member agencies' governing bodies. So there's 11 member agencies plus the county. There's only 3 communities that are accumulating donor funds. That means that all the others can vote to change the JPA and eliminate the provision of donor funds, even if we vote no. So Atherton, Portola Valley, and Woodside are currently the only donor cities, and the JPA agreement itself sets the minimum service level. There's a 1-year termination notice. Every July 1, we have the option of sending our termination notice into the JPA and saying, after that 1 year, we want out. What happens after we get out? There's agreements with respect to furniture, fixtures, equipment. If it's being used and will continue to be used for library services for the residents of San Mateo County, then we keep them. Same with the building. The building's ours. We renovate the building stays ours. We have title to the building, we have title to the property. Any excess funds, here's the kicker though, any excess funds that are held in trust, which are those donor funds, upon termination, revert to the county.
The current funds,
Current funds.
at the time of termination.
At the time of termination.
Right,
So
not future funds.
that's correct. Future funds, what happens in the future, any new library tax revenue that's paid after termination, we collect. And so if there's excess funds, it's in our coffer, but it can only be used for library services. So we could still accumulate that $1 million a year if we were outside of the JPA, but it would be in our coffers. We'd hold on to it. We have to use it for library services. If we exit the JPA and we've accumulated $1 million, $2 million, $3 million by the time we exit, that $3 million stays with the county
Based on the terms of the JPA.
based on the terms of the JPA agreement
Here
today.
you mean literally the county, not the JPA or anything.
Well, they have to be used for library services, so they would keep it within the county library services system.
And the definition of library services, Mayor pushed to have them clarify that in the JPA and potentially expand, what scope that might be.
True, that's correct. So what's on the horizon now? The Library JPA Governing Board has formed a donor subcommittee consisting of some agencies that have donor funds and other agencies that don't have donor funds to talk about amendments to the JPA and the possibility of limiting or eliminating donor fund provisions from the JPA. Elimination of the donor fund provisions mean that the excess funds accumulated locally are retained by the library system for use throughout the entire library system, not just in Atherton. If this occurs, the town loses control over those excess funds generated through the library tax, but on the flip side, there are benefits to the town staying within the JPA, and I'm sure the mayor and the vice mayor can elucidate on some of those as we move forward. So the town's looked at the possibility of reducing that 3.2 cents per $100 of assessed valuation, and in short, what we've been told is the tax could certainly be reduced, but the difference would be spread amongst all the other taxing agencies in the jurisdiction. Meaning that you wouldn't pay the 3.2 cents, you might pay 2.5, 2.2 cents per $100 of assessed valuation, but the difference between that and 3.2 would be spread amongst the other agencies based on, in proportion to their tax that already exists. So your taxes would go down, but the revenue to other agencies would go up, including the town of Atherton.
The same amount to all jurisdictions, would there be a reduction in all the other jurisdictions? Is that why it's problematic, or just Atherton's tax base?
Atherton's tax base. So our local tax, what it would be, it'd be a state legislative action that would, have to go up to the state legislature, be adopted, create a special exception for the town of Atherton and the taxing authority of the town of Atherton. This is actually a county tax, not a local tax, so it would be adjusted in proportion.
So let me clarify that. That's a very important point. When Prop 13 was passed in 1978, the provisions around Prop 13 looked at the allocation of funds within each county in a defined period, which I think was 1975. And based on those allocations, it was established that there would be certain percentages of the new tax amount, which was limited to 1% of property tax value. That would be allocated based on the distribution of tax funds in 1975. The library, which is a special assessment district for us, is 3.2%. And our town is about 8.5%. Fire district's about 13.5% or so. And there were real inequities in that, but that's the way it worked. The first thing that I did when I was appointed to this library governing board is and when this issue of donor funds came up, is I went and met with our state senator, and I asked him about this, and he said, well, there could be an act of the legislature that could readjust those allocations that were set back by Prop 13. So for us, since Atherton uses less than 3.2% of the property tax that we pay to the library, we could reduce that amount. But just if you assume that we reduced it from 3.2 to 1.7, so there would be 1.5%, really we desire to have that refunded, right? Rather than, but what he said to me, or go to the Atherton General Fund possibly, but what he said to me was that's not possible. If you were to reduce that 3.2% to 1.7%, then the 1.5% reduction would be spread amongst the other parties that get the 96.8% that makes up the difference between 3.2 and 100%. So in fact, the direct benefit to Atherton would be quite limited.
And so it's kind of a catch-22 we're in at this point, because back in 1978, when this percentage was attributed to us, no one in their wildest dreams expected Atherton property taxes, property values to go up as high as they are, and that percentage on those, that valuation to be so high. It's disproportionate. That basic structural formula is flawed from back then. And we're in a catch-22 about how then would it be allocated. Because it's now answering the question about why can't we use some of the excess funds for other projects in town. It looks like we're strapped, we can't do that.
Only if those other projects are within the definition of library services, which is a somewhat changing definition. If you look at libraries across the country, libraries are absolutely reinventing themselves. They're much more community centers than they were 20 or 25 years ago, but we would be very careful, and believe me, the JPA would also be very careful to make sure that any proposed use of those funds is for library services. So Bob, you had a question.
We still pay the 1.5 cents. State redivided, not specific to libraries all over the state,
No,
but
the
any way they want.
It would be redivided amongst the parties receiving property tax dollars within the county.
Yeah.
Prop 13 allocated those dollars within each county.
But not for library. I mean,
No,
how do they want to do it?
It's,
I mean, probably there's.
that's what Randy
It's hard
told
to
me.
believe. It's hard to believe, okay.
And that's, and, you know, I'm sure Senator Hill and his aide are very knowledgeable about this. However, you know, I think that it's a very complex situation, and more research.
Well, we could
Can
do,
be
yeah,
done.
that's just the response I got from him.
Right.
And I'm sure there's many, many, many communities across California that are interested in this issue.
But we've got time on our hands because we need almost $13 million to build the new library, plus to build, renovate the council chambers. So,
Based on the master plan.
And Mayor DeGolia, as the JPA representative, has gotten an agreement from.
Well, yeah, we'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
I just want to say, so the city manager has given the background, there may be a little bit more.
Yeah.
We are meeting here at the pavilion because we wanted this to be very interactive. So I want to encourage anyone with questions, or if you feel like your question hasn't quite been answered, to re-ask it, so that this is complex stuff, and we're not trying to get into the details of this JPA agreement, which is a legal agreement, but it has a real impact on Atherton in terms of how our property tax dollars are used. So when I realized this was becoming an issue in the JPA, I asked to have this meeting of a study session of the council so that we could interact with all of you. And I expect that probably, you know, if there's sufficient interest in the community on this issue, that we will have a community meeting here in June, once we see what the proposal is before the JPA. It's still being discussed at the JPA level, but it's close to the donor committee giving a recommendation, and I'll go through those details. Ann?
So, correct me if I misunderstood what the city attorney has said and what you said about the library, but my understanding is that we only have one vote, so basically, and there's only 3 donor cities, Portola Valley, and Woodside, and us, that have excess funds, so that no matter what we want, because there's many other cities involved in the JPA, we could be outvoted, so that's something significant. And then any reduction in the 3.2 isn't going to help us because it's going to go somewhere else. And so basically, my experience in San Francisco in my industry, which is getting severely attacked by the city government, they have over $1 million of driver benefits, and none of the drivers have ever seen a penny of it. So my preference is that we keep our money, and the question I have is if it costs about 1.3 to operate the library in the future per year, does that money come out of if we decide to back out of the JPA so we can keep our own money? Do we have to pay for our library expenses? with the library, they can also be expanded, which would use more money and maybe improve. So can you comment, both of you, on, what I said? Do I have a proper understanding, Josie?
You do. Essentially, that's absolutely correct. If we were to exit the JPA, the money that the town then gets from the library tax, which would be at the current level, even with excess funds, we spend how we like.
And we would, but how do our librarians get paid? They get paid out of that money?
Pay from there.
That
Librarians
from
are
that-
county employees, so,
But right now,
yeah, right now, our library is operated by the county library system.
Right.
All of the employees at the library are county employees. If we were to select to leave the library system, we would have what is currently $2.3 million of property tax revenue allocated to our library usage, and we could decide what to do. One possibility is that we contract with the county library to continue to operate our library, and those same employees remain. We could contract with somebody else. We could do our own library thing. We have lots of options.
Would we still be able to borrow from the larger library?
Yes. There are many cities in San Mateo County that are not part of the San Mateo County library system. Menlo Park, Redwood City, San Mateo, and we all do inter-exchange.
25 to 50,000.
Yeah, so there's a cost associated with that. Now, I want to make one thing clear in response to something that Ann said, which is that she pointed out that we're one of 12 members of this governing board, and there's 3 donor fund cities, so in fact the non-donor fund cities could make a decision that could adversely impact the donor fund cities. That is accurate. However, I want to be very clear. This library JPA really wants us to stay in the JPA. Atherton provides a disproportionate amount of expense of the general JPA funds. I could get into the detail there, but we have a city of 7,000 people. Our support community for the library is somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people. Those tax dollars that come from the 7,000 residents pay for that library, and they would continue to, but there's a piece that we pay to the overhead for the general library system, which is definitely to their advantage. And they also, they are hoping through this amendment process to get some additional dollars to support the general county library operations. There are some things they want to expand in those operations, and I'll get into some of that in detail when we talk about the different proposals that are before, or coming up before this donor fund subcommittee and the JPA. I don't want people to think that we're being railroaded.
Yeah.
It's possible we will be railroaded. I don't want to ignore that possibility, but my perception is that we're not being railroaded, that there's a dialogue that's currently going on.
Thank you.
and what about the art construction? They know that we have plans to rebuild our library. Portola Valley used all of their donor city funds a few years ago to build their library, and that was fine. And so now they're just starting to build up their excess fund again. But it's a smaller and a smaller. Woodside is about to use the bulk of their library donor funds to enhance their library. And all of those requests come to the JPA board, and they're voted and approved. And they're always approved, because when you use it for library services, library funds, like renovation and building. So they know that we have this plan, and they know the amount that we're looking at using, and that's potentially in 2017. So the consensus is that they're not going to make any hard decisions to change or amend the JPA until after that.
Well, yeah, so let me clarify. So when this issue came up, and the way it came up is that the staff, in consultation with some of the members of the governing board, brought the issue of amending the JPA to make some or all of the excess taxes, which are called donor funds now, to make them available to the general library operations. And at the first meeting of the donor fund subcommittee, I informed the donor fund subcommittee that there were two issues that I felt particularly strongly about, that if we could not get the support from the governing board, that it would be pushing Atherton out of the JPA. And one of those issues was the timing of when any change would occur. And I requested that timing not occur until the earliest of the 2017-2018 fiscal year, which begins July 1st, 2018. Our construction plan for the Civic Center,
July 1st, 2017.
July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2018. Right. So the construction plan for the Civic Center is that sometime next spring, we should get plans for the entire Civic Center development, including the new library. And in 2017, we should begin that construction. So we should know what our construction costs are. And when George had laid out what the expected accumulation in that fund will be as of that time, and that should be sufficient to cover our costs. We don't know the hard numbers because the architects have just been hired, but that was one of my requests, was that we not start any change until beginning that year that begins July 1st, 2017. And the second request was that any funds that would be our excess tax dollars, that not just Atherton, but any donor city's excess tax dollars, that they, before they be allocated between a donor city and the general library fund, that they be available for use by the donor city, that is the taxpayers. And the subcommittee unanimously agreed with the first issue, and the staff has proposed a timing that indeed wouldn't begin until July 1st, 2017. So that is in line with what I had requested. The other issue is still being debated. I personally believe there's support on the governing board for that issue, and we can get into that when we move on to the next slide, but I believe there's support for that. That's not the staff proposal, and I'll convey the staff proposal.
So the governing board proposes moving a percentage of those excess funds from the donor city to the county, and then capping the amount that a donor city can then accumulate.
Go back to your other slide, because you...
That's forward.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I'm still finishing
Oh,
this one.
sorry,
Yeah.
okay.
So Atherton, through the subcommittee, is trying to offer suggestions to the JPA board and subcommittee to define or redefine the donor fund provisions in a manner that protects the town's benefit in some ways, so that we get a defined amount of those excess funds. Retain the town's membership in the library JPA if there's a benefit of the town for the town to do that, and potentially authorize use of a portion of those excess funds regionally in support of a general county library benefit service. Now, granted, as the mayor indicated, if 100% is going to the county and it's local property tax dollars, there's no way that's going to happen. But there might be a percentage that the community thinks is appropriate. So the splits could be anything from 50-50, 75-25, 90-10, 80-20, anything between the donor fund city and the county library system. And the cap on the amount in excess that can be accumulated by a donor city still has to be worked out. The county's portion of the excess they're proposing to be used regionally, and the identification of what qualifying library services are for those excess funds to be used locally, and when they take effect. Do they take effect before the split or post the split? That's also an issue that's being debated. So other library services could include expanded library service hours from 57 or more, expanded services and programs within the library, support for a townwide gigabit network, support and development of programming for the townwide network and other library delivery systems, remote library kiosks that identify locations throughout the town, schools, parks, etc., expanded bookmobile programs with enhanced digital resources. All of those could be potential library service programs for use of those excess funds once we have an expanded library to do that with. Then the question becomes, when do those services and programs get reduced from that excess fund? If we're still in the library JPA and there's a split, does it occur before the split or does it occur after the split? So that's a conversation to be had. So those are threshold issues to discuss, the timing issues related to our library, which the mayor just spoke to, the discussion of the sharing concept for excess funds, including a split or a cap, that needs to be discussed by the council and community, and the discussion of other library services and programs and their local application and possibility, and the final one, discussion of the benefits of remaining within the library JPA itself. So with that, turn it back to the council for your discussion.
So, good. First off, as we're building a new library, every new library and even the old libraries in other parts of the county are all getting brand new programs, etc. And one of the things that I'm a little surprised at is that there's been very little discussion from the library as to what new programs they can have. They talk in generalities, but there's no analysis as to what they're going to do or what they could do. I know yourself, or myself, and I know others on the council have spoken to the library about doing things like, bringing in authors to do readings, like they do over at Kepler. That would be a library type activity, holding, teaching different types of cooking. They've agreed to doing those things. We've talked about on the technology committee, bringing in people that would actually help people learn to use the computers, troubleshoot their computers, help them get knowledgeable on different applications. You would be a special IT person that would be a first call that Atherton residents could be good to have. Plus, a new library is going to need new technology. And that technology, we're moving in that direction now, are e-books. If anybody's tried to get e-books, and it is getting better, but they need to buy those new iPod downloadable books. And if we buy them, yes, they're in the library system, but anybody who wants to check them out from Atherton gets first call if they're on waiting list for them. So, buying new content, I think, is another thing that they need to come back with. And I guess I'm a little concerned that the JPA and the library director seem to be moving in a direction to talk about the money before talking about the programs and then seeing how much money might actually be left over. Because I can come up with a way to spend all that money with different programs. I think we all can, buying content and helping out with the network that we're hoping to put together and things like that. So before you have the discussion on the split, I think that there should be a discussion on a brand new library is going to be here. What's on the docket? And if we do have this town-wide internet, how can they exploit it as they're exploiting things in other towns? So I think that they want to delay because they don't know what the library is going to look like. I think those are some comments that I've heard, but they're talking about the money. So I think that we need to put the cart back behind the horse. So to speak.
I agree with you, and that goes back to my comment about defining and clarifying and expanding the phrase library services, because it's changing, and 3D printing, other kind of educational classes. The city manager and I attended a library workshop where we were talking about, brainstorming what does a library mean to you. Write down 3 words that you think of when you think of a library, and you go around the room and say, is it educational? Is it an experience? Is it life learning? And so expanding on all of those categories, it's not just a place where you go and check out a book and bring it back anymore. It's much more meaning here. And so I know that there's a lot of library people here in our audience, and I'd love to hear from them as to some of their ideas about the expansion of library services. And I think there's,
It's Wally Slade. I don't have a specific suggestion now, but what I'm asking you guys, does the county library system right now have what is in corporate world a corporate strategist who is following how libraries are moving ahead and doing things? And if they don't, they're the first ones I would go to see what programs are out there.
so, Wally, that's really good. I mean, they, like at this workshop, that's exact, they had a consultant, an expert, I think from Minnesota or Minneapolis or someplace, and, you know, did the whole walkthrough with us, and, you know, trying to elicit from the elected officials of the library people at that meeting, you know, okay, what is your vision for the future? They're kind of making it up as they're going on here, and so I think it's really up to us as well as the library JPA, even though they do have, you know, ideas and programs that they have used before, that they're continuing to use, and the library JPA gets 4-star, you know, great star awards for being one of the best JPAs in county library systems in the state of California, year after year after year. And so we know how good they are, but we want to make them better. We want to make Alberton's library, you know, more robust and more state-of-the-art for the future.
Well, maybe in our May meeting, we could make our strategic plan of what we think the library is now, because we dedicate an hour to it. Goal setting?
Oh,
Is that some,
setting meeting.
is that some?
Yes, our May 6th meeting.
Yeah, make a plan or our strategic plan of what we think our library should be and get input and get community input and then go back and say, this is what we think of the library. You know, like
Or
Western City.
definition of library services.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so there are sort of two big issues here. One is, what should our library involve? What should our library services involve? It's true that there's lots of room for addition. The 21st century library is in the process of change, and we can have real input to that. We have the advantage of having the tax base, given our library taxes that are already identified, to be able to be creative in that area. So that is one thing, and I want us to discuss that. I just also, one thing I need from the council and the community is some input around this financial relationship, which is a different issue. It's a related issue, but it's a different issue, because I'm in the middle of managing negotiations with the other members of the library governing board, and we're trying to find a compromise that will keep us in this library association. And that requires us to find it acceptable in what some of the changes that are being proposed. And they're willing to negotiate. They're not telling us this is the way it's going to be, because they know that it would be that way without us being in it. So
I think Councilman Lembert's going to.
Yeah, just to, I'm uncomfortable with a bigger picture issue, which is, we're all talking about how we can spend a lot of money or with excess funds. And I feel like we're making assumptions that the law is set in these areas. And I haven't heard anybody really tell me that it is. And it makes me uncomfortable that we're looking for ways to spend money in this bucket, where I've got a lot of other buckets where we're really looking for money, we've got demand for other things. So I would want to be convinced that we don't have any discretion here, the money has to go into this library service, and that 2% can't be adjusted and all of that. But I think that's a fundamental issue, and it's worth diving into. And similarly, on the JPA, what I'm hearing is that in a worst case scenario, it costs us at least a year's worth of revenue to get out. And I find that, challenging, and that's something, again, I want someone to really look at, because just from a governance standpoint, that's not a good place to be, and I would be surprised to adopt you for that, Chris. And if we're accepting the JPA's analysis, I'd question that we shouldn't be sitting there and get our own look at it.
Timeline.
Oh, my goodness, here's our.
And right on to you, our own look.
apologize, I was dealing with a bad issue. We have looked at this issue in the past very thoroughly. I do not trust anybody as far as I can throw them. The agreement we have contractually, we are obligated to pay them the year's revenue to get out. We didn't have to do that. I don't know if we did it at the time. That's the deal we have with them. It's pretty black and white. And secondly, the money comes through state law and through contract. State law says how much property tax goes into the free library. The free library that we have chosen is in fact is governed by a JPA. That JPA is just, it's a contractual arrangement like anything else. And the money that we get from the property tax by state law can only be used for, quote, library purposes. We can't use it, we can't wash it, we can't do anything else to help us with other funds, general funds, things like that. It just has to be used, and our biggest problem with the library JPA has been over who decides how our money coming from Atherton taxpayers is to be used. And again, it's the JPA is setting the rules, and that we have had a member on that went along in the past with these rules. So that's, I guess, where we're at today.
So I just want to roll us back to the fact of, do they set a percentage split before we get to spend our excess funds or after? And I think that that's a fundamental point that I would like to not move off of. I think that as long as we can use these tax funds for our library system in our town that doesn't only serve our 7,000 residents, but serves a greater population of up to 15,000 residents, we should be able to use all of those funds for our library services. And then if there's excess at that point, then we kind of take a look at that. But I mean, before or after, I think that should be.
No, I agree. And if we build something, or we buy content for our library, or we buy specific programming, it goes into the system. They can eventually, the whole county will benefit from it anyway. But to take money before we even made our operating plan is kind of doesn't seem like it's democratic.
So I gotta say that I'm not as optimistic as Rick is how everybody's playing friendly like GPA. This issue first got brought up by Councilmember Carlson himself early 2013, and it seems that when we decided to start questioning the donor fund, all of a sudden now the county feels, or members of the JPA feel, that it's very important that they rewrite the agreement. Well, I think that as an Atherton resident, as a taxpayer, trying to obtain control or try to discuss how Atherton wants to do programming, what can benefit its residents better, serve its residents better, yeah, we're part of the JPA. We throw the largest number of money into the JPA. And of course, if everybody wants a piece of the apple, we're already serving twice, three times the amount of people that we have in town as being a member of the JPA. So I have concerns. I know that we want to think way outside the box, and we want to be more reactive to the residents of Atherton. And it seems that being a party of the JPA, we're having to go to the board that we only have one member. I know that the words are that they never say no. Well, I gotta tell you, when there's money involved, they'll start saying no. And I don't like the fact that, frankly, we also have a drop dead time, I guess, set for roughly 2017. And I hope we're all optimistic that everything's done by 2017 and all of our funds related to the development of the town site. But what if, for example, that the fiber optics isn't done, or some other factor? Are they going to say, well, I'm sorry, the agreement's now rewritten, now we're going to have to consider that as part of one of your expenditures in your account? I mean, as a taxpayer that's paying this big lump of money to the library program, to see a lot of it go to other directions and not really serve the benefactors and the taxpayers of the jurisdiction, it's just wrong. So, I know that we want to be more creative in programming, and to go to a board that it's not us, it's not a membership group that represents the town's interests, it's a county-wide library system's interests. I mean, that's like talking about issues related to SFO.
So I got those things identified,
Right.
written into the agreement that library services can include the following.
Exactly. But, there's a lot of benefit for being in the JPA, and there has been over the years because of the programming that the JPA has provided for our library. We've got people, the Friends of the Library, residents here that can attest to that. So it's not all bad. I mean, they've really, but it's not, it's just that the numbers have gotten really big, okay? And so we really need to spend our existing library excess funds on a new library and library services, but it's like going forward. And I don't think there's any discussion about them taking and keeping any of that money.
Sure. So let me address a couple issues. The first, using the July 1st, 2017 date doesn't require us to have our construction done by then. The issue is any funds that will have accumulated by then will be available just for the donor city to use. They will not be available to the overall library. So if you look at our current funds, they're $8.6 million in the fund, and if they continue to accumulate at the rate of $1.3 million a year, they'll be about $13.5 million, I think.
Well, another 2.6 basically after.
No, 3.9 is 3 years. So there'll be 12.5 million by then, which is quite hard to believe that our library, including the refurbishment of the existing town hall, will exceed that cost. That's very hard to believe. When you look at other library costs, it's very, very hard to believe that we'll get there. So I personally think we're in good shape with that. Now, be aware, that's one issue. Second issue, to make this change to the donor funds arrangement requires an amendment of the JPA. So I have told them, okay, well, if the JPA is up for amendment, then in addition to clarifying what is included in library services, and we want this to be broad, we don't want this to be narrow, there's some other things that we want clarified in this amendment. One is, right now, we are considered, based on the population of the town, to be an under 10,000 person library, which limits our library hours to 40 hours a week, and anything we do in excess of that, we pay for. Well, in fact, we're servicing a community that is between 10 and 15,000. So one thing that I've asked to make sure we change when we amend the agreement is to give recognition for libraries that are serving more than 10,000. They'll get the benefit of more than 10,000. So in fact, Atherton will get 60 hours a week with that amendment rather than 57 hours a week, which is a benefit to us. The other change that I've asked for is to look at what happens if a member of the JPA chose to withdraw. Because right now, by the terms of the agreement, if you withdraw, you lose the accumulated funds that you have at the time of withdrawal. And, everybody here has talked about that as forfeiting a year's worth of the excess tax. Well, one thing that I've asked for is a withdrawing member would retain the accumulated funds. They wouldn't lose the accumulated funds. And that amendment can be made just like the amendment to the donor fund provisions. That hasn't been agreed to. That has been heard.
But you can see the rationale when the JPA was first written. There was going to be some ongoing costs. You did notice that year, and they wanted to make sure that those ongoing costs were paid for throughout that year. Instead of when you terminate, it's all taken care of. You don't owe library system is not in debt for that year. And so, but that was back in 1999, and things really started, well, that's when it was amended. It was first.
No, it was formed in 99, amended in 2004.
Okay, that's right. So,
The basic point, the basic,
yeah.
which you get a little bit of complex, and I think that it's our sense that these funds always, colloquially, are ours, it's our money. It sounds like from the county's perspective, it's no, those funds belong more broadly to the county. That's sort of, that's it in a nutshell. Yeah, and
So
I do
you should
believe
recognize,
strongly.
yeah, but you should recognize that our funds are paying for the operation of the library that serves not just us, but serving 15,000 people.
But we-
Okay, so that, because we brought that up when we first started talking about a new library, and they came and they said, no, you need to have it this big and that big, because of the fact that it needs to service the service area, where some of it is, way on the other side of the park. But, so there does need to be that recognition.
And I
And it's
suspect the
great that
way
you
they're
brought that up.
calculating expenses is also something we look at real closely to find out it's on track.
It's been a little hard to get them to completely give us a bucket by bucket by bucket accounting.
I'm sure.
Okay, and Councilmember Carlson and I, work, trying to get them to do that.
They're more responsive now than they have been, but
Yeah.
it's not easy.
Well, because we're kind of bringing it out to the open.
So maybe I can, sure.
I have, well, actually, two questions. The first one is, I'm sorry, I was going to it's direct to you, is if we withdraw from the JPA, does the state law about how our, library taxes still apply and have to give that to the library? If we're out of the association, do we then have control over our own money? Is it, okay, that was the first part, sorry for that. That's
Well,
it. Second question is why?
It depends on, if we withdraw, then what do we do? If we do our own library, then those monies would come to us. If we just withdraw and say, okay, we're not gonna have a library, then the money goes back to the county and the county spreads it over.
Okay, so the second one was, I'd like to understand why is it Menlo Park chose not to do so, because they have not been running for a long time, and I would think that there might be interesting for us to look at the reasons why they draw.
Well, it's not only Menlo Park, it's with the city and San Mateo, and Union City.
But they didn't
They
withdraw from the
never-
JPA.
they never-
They never joined.
They never
Okay,
did.
I'd like to understand why, I'd like, because I actually regard the I'd like to understand why they chose not to do it. Thank you.
It gets really complicated in California because there's, I think, 3 systems for libraries. You can do, and they go back over 100 years, and they said at the time, and it's been amended over time, you can either have a county-free library system, you can have your own library system, even some really small cities. The city of Lakeport has its own library. Or you can have, there's a library district or something and we just happen to be in the one where we, some years back, opted for the JPA. Good or bad, that's where we are. And now there's state laws that talk about if you withdraw from a library JPA to form your own, there's also collective bargaining. If the library that you're withdrawing from has union members, then you have to go through another level of hoops as well.
But we could establish a good charter.
My understanding.
Yep.
Yes,
Yes, it makes it just a little bit more difficult.
Yes.
More historic. Can't remember if it was the big two times. Did you get proposals? We would fall out. We had proposals for services for Urban City, Menlo Park, and some other districts, bigger Sacramento, but somebody else that wanted to provide that. At the time, we didn't have staff to handle it, so we had to wait to do that. We also wasn't going to have money. But we still could have done for a better price, provide better hours, longer hours, better service, better programs, and I wish we could.
So maybe I should describe the 2 proposals that are before the subcommittee. Chuck?
Makes it clarifying questions. I'm sorry, Bill, the question is, would we have greater discretion to define what is library related if we go on our own and do operating through
For sure. And that's like, anytime you have another higher level of government telling you what to do, you have less control
So
than if you
if
do.
we go on our own, we, in theory, might be able to broader variety of things.
Okay, so currently, there are two proposals before the subcommittee. One proposal from the library staff and another proposal from me. And I really want feedback from the council to see if I'm going in the right direction here. The proposal from the library staff is, and I've got this laid out in 4 different, maybe you can go back to the prior slide, but it's not on the slides, but there's 4 different stages. The first is that all funds that are excess funds, and excess funds are defined to be funds in excess of the operating cost for your library plus your overhead for the administration. So any funds in excess of the operating costs would be subject to a percentage allocation. That's number 1. Number 2, that the percentage allocation would be 50%. So 50% of the excess tax dollars would be available to, this is in each year, would be available to the donor city, and 50% of the excess tax dollars would go into the general fund of the library system. And number 3 is that those funds that are restricted and go into the donor city's restricted fund would be subject to a cap. And the proposal is a cap of $1 million. Okay, so anything in excess of that $1 million, even if you're accumulating 50%, if you hit $1 million, anything in excess of that $1 million goes into the general fund. That's the staff proposal.
The county general fund.
Yeah, the county's general fund. Not the
our
county
general fund.
library general
Yeah,
fund.
county
For
library.
use by the library, solely for library purposes, okay?
That's not good.
No, that's the staff proposal, Bob.
So if it operates under that scenario, we would not accumulate the $9 million we have in the
Exactly.
library.
That's absolutely
Right.
right.
The only way we could get a new library would be to beg JPA and whoever else we had to beg to give us some money to put in the new library.
Or our citizens, like we're doing with the Civic
Special
Center.
tax.
Or, yeah, if the library has money, so,
Spend it without.
Okay, so that's the staff proposal. The proposal that I've made is, number 1, in terms of timing, that we not consider any change before July 1st, 2017. Okay, that has basically been agreed to as a proposal. Number 2, that any funds that are in excess of the operating costs of the, and we'll call it Donor City Library, be subject to use by that donor city for library purposes. So those purposes include maintaining the library facilities, which right now are not part of the San Mateo County Library responsibilities. The San Mateo County Library is responsible for operating the library, not maintaining the facility. So the donor funds, the excess tax dollars would be available for the facilities cost. That's a cost that's currently there. They would be available for other library purposes as determined by the donor city before they're subject to any percentage allocation. And those other library purposes we can brainstorm about, and I want to. I have brought to the attention of the library a desire to consider what is a 21st century library, and as a heart of a 21st century library is looking at the management of information, not just in the form of books, but in the form of electronic media, and making that available over a fiber network, which could be available to all residents. So it's the concept of the 21st century library is bringing the library into each of your living rooms, not just having you go to the brick and mortar library. And that, by the way, is definitely a concept that is being broadly promoted by the more adventurous libraries across the country. And our library system embraces that. That has not, I mean, there's questions when we talk about what it might cost to build a gigabit network in Atherton for our service community. There's real questions at the governing board level, but nobody challenges that the concept of conveying information electronically may not be a library service. No one has challenged that. So in my proposal, the donor city would be able to access those funds for library purposes prior to any allocation. Like I said, that was one of the two really key points for me. Then the third is that after that use on an annual basis, that the remainder would be subject to a percentage allocation, and that might be 50% like the staff had proposed, but it might be 75-25 or 80-20. I'd like your input on your thoughts about that. The fourth is that the unrestricted fund, the unrestricted fund, so that at that point where there's an allocation, there's a portion that goes to the donor city, let's call those restricted funds, therefore used by the donor city, and there's a portion that goes to the library, which the staff has proposed are unrestricted funds. They go into the library's general fund account. And the staff wants that so they can plan for hiring additional staff and for incurring additional expenses that they can plan for in the future that are not just an annual decision. Well, I've proposed that those funds that would be subject to control by the staff not just go into their general fund, but go into a pool that then is available for any of the libraries within the county library system to apply to for special purposes, and that the staff themselves could apply to for special purposes. That is something that the staff has objected to because they want to be able to count on those funds to increase the staff on an ongoing basis and not just to use on an annual basis. And there's a discussion of that at the governing board, where there's other governing board members that like that idea a lot, don't particularly want to give a green light to building the general staff, given the pension issues and a number of other issues related to that. But what happens to those funds that go into the staff area is an open issue. And then the final thing is those funds that are restricted, that stay at the donor city level, what is the cap that they're subject to? It may be uncapped, they may be able to grow without a cap, or they may be capped. And the discussion about those last two items I've issued that's come up at the governing board is there's a proposal from the city manager in Brisbane that the percentage of allocation that occurs at the allocation, at that initial allocation after the donor city has used its funds, would go into the general fund for the staff to use as they wish. But if the accumulated funds then hit the cap, any of that percentage that would exceed the cap would go into this fund where people would make application to use, rather than go into the staff's general fund. I'm not saying we would, I'm just telling you what the proposal,
Well, you said it was your proposal.
that I'm trying to work with them. Okay, I'm trying to structure something so they feel, I frankly think that if we have so Bill's question was, why do we want to consider a cap? And my response to that is, if we're being creative about how to use the funds, and if we have the ability to use all the funds before they're subject to an allocation, we can kind of manage that by choosing library purposes to use them.
But equipment, like a depreciation fund, a sinking fund for replacement of the building, that would be part of the operational cost.
No, I think that would be considered facilities costs.
Because you would need to have that too, else we'd never.
That would be considered facilities costs, and that has not been proposed yet.
Right, and so whatever you end up really proposing and, negotiating, I think has to be agreed to by the council.
My sense is that we're in effect fiduciaries for Atherton's funds, and I'd be really reluctant to agree to anything that would cede control of those. I mean, a percentage, a cap, any of that stuff. If you have to for some reason, if there's a reason that we have to, then we have to. But beginning, my thought would be we would want to keep as much control over as best we possibly can. To save money.
Yeah, so let me tell you what I think the consequence of that is.
Yeah,
I think if we take a position and say we're not gonna do it,
yeah.
they're gonna do it. They're gonna do it. And
But-
then we're
but
gonna
then-
leave, and
again,
we're gonna lose $1 million, we're gonna lose 1 year's worth of accumulated
We need
revenue.
to try.
Or we got a
If I
lawsuit.
think-
But we got a
But
lawsuit.
I think we gotta try.
If you spend money on a lawsuit, you can spend the money on a lawsuit.
I don't think we should,
I'm sorry.
I agree with Mike, I don't think that we go into negotiations saying, hey, this is what we want. Well, no, we want more than that, because these are Atherton donor funds, we could ask the Hail Mary, as far as I'm concerned, granted that these are Atherton funds in a county system, but yet tax dollars are generated from this area. So I think we've got to ask for the Hail Mary, so that we can try to maintain more of the control of the funds that. So, and I,
Dee Dee, then Ann.
I'm listening to you and Bill, and
Please speak up or stand up.
what we're listening to is how much they want us to stay. But if they really want us to stay, why are they making a proposal that says, here's what we're gonna do for you, applicant, for your extra money, and this is how much we want you to stay? If they can't do that, I'm not going to get out. It may cost us some money. But we have a wonderful library group, we will revisit that money and spend it on all kinds of things where the council, we should, we really need to use it now, this money spent here. You're making your wise call, ladies and gentlemen,
yeah.
by creating this process that is going to be impossible to figure out how much money we're going to get.
Well, I was just thinking, since you were wanting to work with them, Rick, and, well, first of all, why do we need a cap? That's one question. And then the other thing is, if there was some way that you could propose that Atherton had control of the projects, Atherton needs to approve of the excess donor money funds as to, needing to approve, because it's our money, as to how those funds are being spent. You know, so it's like, not like a Barbary Coast, San Francisco, where somebody hires their boyfriend. So just to add, since you're trying to work with them, and, try and sort of structure it so we can use as much money as possible, if they insist on getting some of our donor monies, we can insist on control, that we will release it unless we approve the use that they're allocated for. But it's gonna be a bureaucrat nightmare, and, all sorts of people tell them that, so I don't wanna give this larger company control over me. And I know you're just trying to work with them in a goodwill way, and, I don't know where it's gonna go, and none of you is. But as far as the strategic plan, and to mention something that Whitmer suggested, I think that that's gonna develop when we see how the building develops and what kind of needs the new building and the new master plan. So I don't see it really feasible for us to come up with a strategic plan now, because like a flower, it's gonna unfold as we go forward.
Technology will change too, it's changing so fast.
Yeah, but I feel guilty saying anything, 'cause I haven't spent enough time in the libraries ever, when I was in grade school. But I'd have to have some feeling for these so-called benefits for belonging to the JPA to assess it against a one-time charge of $1.3 million. But just, unless those benefits are substantial, it seems to me we'd be wiser to pull the plug and keep control of our own money.
Are we sure we just lose 1 year's work instead of 1 half?
Well,
I think one of the key points here is Rick's talking about a 21st century library system. When you look at the whole situation, 9 out of the 12 libraries here are not, you'd be able to, they're in deficit. It's only 3, and we know why that is, because these are wealthier communities that pay more property taxes. The problem can be solved if we find library services, which will use more of the money. So I'm definitely in favor of trying to expand and improve our library to use those services.
Which we need to do whether we stay in the JPA or not.
Exactly. Will this be made available on the town's website, all this material?
It is now.
It is now, okay, all right, thank you.
Yes, just in addressing the timing issue, and maybe one suggested, because there is an issue of timing, should they amend the JPA before we want them to amend the JPA? Perhaps one of the requirements is that they formally commit to funding or allowing the town to use all of our donor funds accumulated to entirely fund our new library design and construction in advance of any amendment to the JPA.
Yes. So it would be very, very bad form for the governing board to do any kind of adverse ruling like that, and then that in effect would deny us the use of all of our accumulated funds to date and going forward. Because the precedent has been set that whenever, Portola Valley needed their money, they got it all. Woodside needed their money, they got it all. It would be very bad form for them to essentially to amend the agreement by a 2/3 majority to, in essence, to have a taking of our excess donor funds.
The more public we make that
Okay.
commitment, the better.
There's no proposal for that
No,
at
I
any
know.
level, and I think that is something that would generate a lawsuit, and they're aware of that. Personally, I don't think that's possible. Frankly, to be totally frank,
I'll be angry, no.
I mean,
Okay.
my desire is, look, we have control here because we can leave this JPA if we want to. We have to weigh the benefits and the adversities that would result from that. But right now, by the terms of the JPA, if we do that, we lose 1 year's worth of accumulated excess tax dollars, which is about 1.3 million today, maybe about $1 million once we have our new library built. If this JPA is amended and the amendment includes the ability of any withdrawing participant to take their accumulated dollars, then we would not suffer that risk. And even if the JPA is amended to put in a percentage allocation of the excess tax dollars and a cap, we could still leave. So if in fact we're able to amend the JPA to take any accumulated dollars, we don't give up the ability to decide to leave. In fact, in that case, even if we amend it in a way that, if it were to happen in the future, wouldn't be the most desirable thing for us, we may be able to have it amended so that we take our tax dollars, we don't lose a year's worth of tax dollars.
What can they?
I think that would be a very strategic, that's the position that I would advocate for Atherton, because I think it's the most strategic position, and I think it most represents the fiduciary duty that we have to our taxpayers. And if we choose just to take a hard line, like some people here have suggested, and we just sort of throw it down and say, we're not going to agree to any change, then I think that they will amend the agreement, and we will be adversely impacting our taxpayers by guaranteeing that we'll lose $1 to $1.3 million.
You're only saying the $1 to $1.3 million in that year's.
That's right.
law.
That's right.
Only if we don't have uses for it. I mean, that's like the excess fund, right? Am I getting that right? So, I mean, if we're spending that
Or
during
that's
that
right.
last
That's
year,
right. That's
so
right.
it's not,
Or if-
that is not a finite
But-
amount of money.
But if we come in with a, draw a hard line in the sand, we're not on the same page here, then there's no assurance that the JPA is going to agree to what we propose to use these excess tax dollars for.
Yeah, so, first off, I think there's benefits to being in the JPA. That said, I'm concerned that today the amendment says if you pull out, you lose that year's excess.
No, that's what the agreement
It's
says,
agreement,
not the
okay.
amendment.
If
Right
they
now?
amend it,
Yes.
if they amend it
Everything.
after we.
No, there's a legal opinion that says what you have accumulated, you, no, sorry,
No.
you're right, you're right.
If we
What
don't
you've
spend
accumulated,
it,
you
if we
lose.
don't, yes, then
So-
we need to spend it, yes,
So,
all of it.
that's right.
If we pull it
That's
out
right.
today, we'd
That's
lose everything. So
That's
that's why
right.
we want, but they,
That's right.
and they understand, they want us to build a new library.
Yes.
It will be really good for the county
Yeah,
and our
the county
service
staff
area.
wants the new library,
That
and
we
they,
build a new library.
They just need to be.
But
that's right.
And the effectivity, if we get an agreement that we don't like, we need to push out the effectivity date of the agreement. That's gotta be,
Yeah.
number one thing.
Yeah.
If you don't get anything, then you gotta at least get the
That goes to
effectivity
George's.
out there that we
Yeah.
can go ahead and get our project done, and then we can give them the notice with minimal impact.
So the current proposal, the only thing that's locked in terms of the adjustment is the time. That's-
But I think that the town managers mentioned something that's pretty important. We should put a provision in there that protects us because we go along and, we're in this development of the town center and that library is in it. We would surely want to make sure that the guarantee that the funding is there for the monies that we're spending, the taxpayers, the thought that we're going to go into that bucket. Well, now, as you just heard, all that money can disappear tomorrow, that this member of the JPA sure would be bad business on their part, but they can do it. So I
No,
think
they can
that
only
we
do it
should-
if we withdraw.
But we should have a provision in there that assures us that we have the funding in play and hopefully it's spent by 2007.
Well, it sounds like priority number one is to do whatever the steps are, to get something in writing from the JPA that says, hey, guys, your new library's a done deal. Whatever, it costs $13 million, we're not gonna take your $13 million. What steps are those?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
That's-
that's a guarantee and that's something we should.
Yeah. So let's put this in perspective. The library JPA's annual operating budget for 13-14, is it 13-14 I'm looking at? 2014 was 24.4 million. That's their operating budget. We, we're contributing, 2.3 right now. And so,
10%.
yeah.
And
20% of the library has got 12 to 13
It's actually 11 members plus the county, so there's 12. There's 11 cities, including us.
And just a point of clarity, the governing board isn't the body that approves and actually amends the JPA. The amended JPA agreement has to come back before the city councils of every member agency for approval.
Which means it will take some period of time, and then it's going to take, as a practical matter, if they rush it, within 6 months, 9 months.
No, it's not proposed to be rushed.
I'm, in a worst case scenario, if it were rushed, it would still take, my point is it would take some time.
And it's a political process.
2 months, it could be done in 2 months if there was unanimous.
Yeah.
If it was rushed and everybody agreed and it just, because everybody has one meeting in every month and you only need 30 days before it's adopted, second reading.
So,
I take 90 days.
Rick, for what it's worth, I agree with your thought. If we can, figure out a way to get out more easily, that would be a huge leverage point, and we would change that. I do think, however, it'd be internally consistent with amendments that the board is looking at would want us to get out, meaning if they put a cap on, they'd be reluctant to let us out easily, because they kind of negate each other. They figure it out.
Because our revenue is not going to decrease. It's going to continue. We're going to continue to have this amount of money that is generated every year.
Probability increase.
But not as rapidly as over the last 5 years, and last 3 years. Yeah. Essentially.
does anybody else have any comment?
Got one last one. I don't, this definition of the 21st century library and everything might include, there may or may not be a place to go find a document that defines it, I doubt it. one possibility to go in that direction. In my business, a number of times I used Stanford University cooperated with professors. They turn graduate students loose on a project like that for a term. You get incredible input from an effort like that because they want to get an A on it, and they're very smart kids. And that's something that you can start work on, kind of take very little staff time, very little council time to get something going in that direction.
Really nice, excellent idea. So at the League of California Cities conference last September, then Mayor Wiest and I talked to the city of Brentwood, who are doing lots of innovative libraries. And so there are some cities in the Southern California area that are really promoting and doing innovative libraries that we should be doing more research on. If in fact, well, we are going to.
We should take a
And
look.
Rick, by the way, when you
Take
refer to
notes.
those,
Yeah, let's
when
take
you
a look.
refer to those libraries, you might call them progressive instead of adventurous.
Yeah.
So one thing that's been suggested to me, which I think is a really good idea, is that rather than our library staff, I don't mean the Atherton Library, I mean the county library staff, being so focused on the availability of this new set of funds for their revenue, they should be giving some guidance to the donor cities about how to best use those donor city funds to improve library services for both the donor city and the library in general.
Yeah.
And
But I disagree with the fact that they want to take the percentage and just throw it into their general fund and use it for operational costs, hiring additional staff on an ongoing basis.
you disagree with,
Take money and building their county-wide staff
Right,
and making more and more liabilities.
right. By hiring permanent employees.
One question, what happens if for some reason you can't come up with the necessary funding for the town center? And you have to go beyond the 2017 date?
well, yeah, so that's a good question. So I understand with regards to the library. Yeah, so the tax dollars, the excess tax dollars will continue to accumulate. So if you look at the dollar amount that will have been accumulated, whether we actually use it for the library or not, it will be about 12.5 million by June 30, 2017. So if that money is available for us to use for our library, whether we use it in 2017 or 2020, it'll still be available. Now, and I mean, of course, unless we were to leave the library system and we weren't to amend the terms of the JPA.
That would be a foolish decision.
Right.
We'd all be fired.
All right, so we knew this item would take a while, so the budget item was on the agenda purely for an overview for the council and community, so we got about a half hour, and usually I would turn it over to Robert, but I'm going to go through it rather quickly.
You're going to fast.
I'm going to fast slide it, and if you have any questions, Robert and I are both here to answer any questions as we go. But it's purely meant as an overview. This is Councilmember Lembers' first time through the budget process, and the mayor's first time through as mayor. So that's why it's on the agenda. The actual budget detail and discussion will be at future council meetings. We have a May 6th budget meeting. We have an April 15th budget meeting. We have a second one in May and 2 in June. So there's a number of public meetings coming up that we will organize throughout the community to make sure we get going.
Robert talks too long.
Yes. He's a close second behind Mr. Connors here.
Let's move on, let's move on. Got a half an hour.
So the staff report that you got is pretty detailed. The PowerPoint presentation is not. So it's available on the website. It's got 6 components to it. Our 14-15 year-end projected fiscal condition, which is pretty healthy. Major revenue sources and 5-year forecasts with those assumptions. Major expenditure categories and 5-year forecasts. And then a discussion of the budget document itself, the format, what fund accounting is. Governmental accounting is different than private sector accounting. There's fund accounting, there's other bases of accounting, it's a little bit different. And then a general budget calendar with those dates that I talked about earlier on. So our general fund revenues to expenditures in 14-15 budget, you see what that over under is down there at the bottom, 155,000. In the next year, I'm sorry, the 14-15 estimated for completion of that year, this year, it was -384. When you add ERAF and the parcel tax back in there for some of the allocations we made, we're back in the positive again. So what does that impact on our fund balance, our bottom line? Our 14-15 expenditures adjusted is 12.6. The projected ending balance is 11.5. We have our 2 reserve requirements based on our operating costs, a 15% emergency reserve of 1.8, our 20% contingency reserve of 2.5, and then our building department operational reserve, which was established a number of years ago as we transitioned from employee staff to contract staff. That's at 505,000. Total reserve requirement of 4.9. That comes out of that 11.5 number. So that means that unallocated general fund balance, not allocated to a reserve requirement or building reserve, is approximately $6.6 million. Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick question for the chair, please. The building operating reserve of 505,000, is that a cumulative amount, or is that just a one annual, every year we only have that much in our reserve account? We don't, and the reserve account that we had last year, we either spent, and now there's another reserve account. It's
No, that'll change. In prior years, it was higher. This operating reserve, I think, is the point where maybe eliminate this building component and then you'll go into the unallocated component of reserves.
Why would we do that?
Well, because, like George alluded to, when we had created this reserve, it was because we were going from in-house building department to outsource of the building department. And so in doing that, we didn't know if our revenues or our fees were going to be enough to sustain whether we had to do some additional inspections based off of the old system of, so that's why we kept that reserve.
this is like-
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, gathered.
But Robert, you know, as you pointed out, it was when Midwest came in and they were getting a revenue share, but they were also doing inspections on projects
Right.
that we'd already taken the revenue for. The average, that should be run out like
Yes.
next year, it should be done.
Right.
And we should go down to zero, anything left goes in the general
Right.
fund, because the average, you know, a remodel is 1 year, a construction, I think it's a 3-year limit without a penalty. And of course, if there was a penalty paid, then the interest would get that. So I would think that that number could be,
We can,
Nothing.
Yeah, right. And that's what I said, we can eliminate it.
actually,
And
it should be
would go
nothing this
into
year, I think.
Unallocated, correct. I've communicated with Brett, our building inspector, in looking at that. The outside inspections on the whole permit is really gone to almost, like 20,000. So if we.
It will go from restricted to unrestricted at some point, probably in the next year.
Okay.
Great.
So general fund major revenue sources, 5-year forecast, we have 4 major revenue sources in the town. We've got the property tax, which represents about 65 to 70% of our revenue. Building fees, which are about 15%. Parcel tax, which is about 3.2%, goes to PD operations. That's the component only within the general fund. That's all we're talking about at this point. There's another component of the parcel tax, the 80% that goes to capital projects. ERAF, it's about 10%, and we're counting that as a below-the-line revenue. We're not dependent upon it for our general operations. And we think that's the most fiscally responsible thing for us to do, because it's always a target. As long as we can get by doing that, all the better. So what we're looking at there, property taxes 5 years out, building fees, parcel tax, excess ERAF. The property taxes are projected about 3.5 to 4.6, 4.6% in 15, 16, and 3.5 flat going out in the future years. Is that correct, Robert?
It's 4.6 going out for the remaining years, but we put the 3.5 to 4.6 because that would be the range. But it's 4.6.
So you actually calculated 4.6 million dollars?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So building fees are projected at 3%, parcel tax is projected flat because that's 20% of the set number. ERAF is projected conservatively at $700K. This past year, we received about 1.2.
Yeah, and previous years it was 892,000 in 12-13, 1 million last year. This fiscal year we received 1.2 million being back. Is there a time of year in January?
So other revenue sources, sales and use tax, franchise fees, business licenses, planning, DPW, and park. Those are all minor revenue sources for the town's budget, and those are projected to sure will be at 2%. Although Robert got something in the mail today, which was quite astounding. Of that sales and use tax, about 161,000 of that is actually sales tax, sales and use tax. The rest of it is
Public safety component?
Prop 172 monies that we get and things like that, but only about 161,000 of it is based on true sales tax to the town. We've got no commercial businesses, so when things sell, somebody buys something on eBay and their science location's out, you can get funds. And it's an advance based on projections, is the way we get paid by the state. So we got a check today for
$374,000.
Holy moly, wow.
And that was for the fourth quarter.
Is that because-
San Mateo County is doing well.
A sale took
So-
place.
so-
Somebody bought something.
That's for 1 quarter?
No, so
Fourth
as
quarter.
people start to buy on the internet, if they're from Atherton, do we get a benefit from that?
if the site of sale location is.
At the site of,
So, if
the
it's
buyer
somebody's-
or the seller?
Yes.
Which?
It's the seller.
Seller.
So somebody's in their garage selling something?
Somebody sold, projected,
In previous years, there was paintings that were sold that we received that the person, there was a tax paid, the sales tax that was paid off of that. But
And cars?
But cars, when you go purchase the car, the part of that sale doesn't just go to wherever you buy it, it goes to your home address to sell some use tax on it. So when you buy cars, Atherton does a portion of that.
So this is underestimated.
This is definitely under.
as of today, yes.
As of today.
So it'll be more like 6.
So we,
But it's not
make sure
moving forward.
whoever you get your sales tax.
Right, I'm gonna find
Everybody else
that
will
out.
have a business license from that.
I don't know that you
Well, I
can
mean,
actually track it,
you
can you?
wouldn't necessarily need one. If you sold paint mixes, you wouldn't necessarily need a business license.
Right,
It's a
right,
state
right.
sale.
And so where's the Measure A funds?
So-
The Measure A funds are not in this?
No, that's
Those are
CIP.
extra.
So are there other potential revenues? Certainly, yes. We talked about a number of them. Some of them, like the cell tower leases, we get the minimum numbers, $3,200 a month. But we haven't got any yet, and they're gonna have to all come before the city council as leases, so we are reluctant to put any future potential revenue into our budget as projected revenue until it's realized in some way. So we didn't include that. We also didn't include business license revenue increases. As you know, business license is a tax, so it's got to go to a vote of the community in order to amend it, to increase its scope and span. So before that occurs, we're not going to be putting that into the budget.
We need to do that, because we talked about it
Yes.
last summer doing it, and here we are in the summer again.
But-
Right,
To move
we're
forward.
working with, the problem was getting, we had to get the historical data and we worked with unions and services throughout this past, since from last year to now, to collect that data on whether we want to do it based off of, the categories of the flat tax, or we want to do it based off of gross revenue, or what we've done within the city, so we wanted to capture that component, that's why it's taking us some time.
I just
We needed
really
those.
But it is
want
moving
to
forward.
caution everybody, we don't want to
Right.
create a fee that is actually a tax and collect it and then have to refund it.
Right.
Okay?
Business
Okay.
license is a tax.
All right,
Or
and
is
so
it-
if we're gonna adjust it, it's gotta go out
Yep.
and be passed, but
Correct.
let's be creative, but legally,
It's a
Simple majority as long as it goes into the general fund.
as long as it's special.
Utility users tax is another tax that we didn't, it's got to go to a vote, so we didn't put that in there, but we talked about that. And then, of course, the real property transfer tax, the threshold issue there is a charter city issue. So until some of those issues get resolved, we're not putting them into the budget as guaranteed revenue sources. Moving forward to project operational costs of the building. General fund expenditures 5-year forecast as a percentage of the budget. We've got 6 major categories there: admin, finance, building, interdepartmental and OPEB costs, police and DPW, the largest of which is pretty evident. That's our police department at 52.4% of our general fund operational expenditures.
Always been that.
Always been
Always been
that.
that.
So the major components of operational costs are labor costs. Those are forecasted forward at about 3.5%. Again, that does not mean that everybody's going to get a 3.5% raise every year. That's just, there's a projection forward. Pension costs, those are the two percentages for local miscellaneous and local safety with CalPERS. The OPEB ARC, we've been making adjustments to our OPEB unfunded liability. We've been paying that down. Our ARC is going to change. So we didn't put any major increases in our ARC. Operational expenditures forecasting forward 5% are the general operational costs. And then we have the unknown additional contributions to CalPERS. We might do some of those as well. That would impact our internal departmental funds.
Well, there's also the workman's comp, which is a big issue and big number, so that should be called out.
Right.
I would think that you would call that out.
Yeah. So significant, it's mentioned in the staff report, I just didn't put it into the card. Significant professional services costs. As you know, we've transitioned from having employees for a lot of things to having contract staff for a lot of things, and they're basically, for all intents and purposes, staff. And so our building contract is about $945K. Our public works contract, NCE, $575K. That is not the projected number going forward. That's the current number. We're in negotiations, as you know, for next year's cost. Public Works Director, that's Mike Kashiwagi et al. That's about $175K. Park Event Services, catering by Dana, their costs are right now about $74K based on anticipated revenue. As our revenue goes up, their cost goes up. Just like our building services contract, as our revenue goes up, our costs go up.
So we have a positive again.
Oh, yes,
Okay,
most certainly.
okay.
Well, it shows 150,000 mark revenue on the revenue slide.
Planning services, about $190K, and then legal services, the gentleman sitting to my right, about $154K.
It's reasonable. It's reasonable.
So looking at all of those in a chart, shows total down there at the bottom, 5 million, 5.2, 5.5, increasing as those percentages go up.
Council, $120,000. It costs administratively that much for you to manage us.
Oh yeah, it costs a lot to manage.
We're going to start allocating.
These are not salaries.
We're not getting.
There are no
any
salaries and benefits in
I
these
just want to
numbers.
make that point, okay?
You all work for free.
One person's getting a check, we just want to know who it is.
In the city council budget, as you know, you go to conferences, there's a number of memberships that the town has, and then you also have the rail committee.
Oh, so
that
you
comes out of your
add
budget.
those memberships, those fees?
Those are part of your
The
basic operational costs for
You
the
mean
council.
like the
budget.
airport roundtable, $750 a year?
Yeah, all those things are within the city council budget.
The police operational costs seems.
These are no
This doesn't
salaries and
include
benefits.
salaries.
And these numbers are not salaries and benefits. These are just professional services, which are advertising,
Yeah.
professional service contracts, utilities, IT, phone services, everything else. Everything that's not people, except for legal services.
That's because there are computers, the overhead for space.
The legal number includes the legal service number?
Yes,
He's a
it does.
contractor.
One contract employee.
With that side.
$154,000 is what I.
That would happen to be a subset of people.
Correct.
Well, yes.
Because,
Only in case I have to hire outside counsel or something for arbitration.
and the only thing not in here, is your salaries and benefits for your actual town employees. Your contract services are in these numbers.
17.
Roughly, yes.
About 36 employees.
And the five of us.
And the bottom view for free. So the town actions to control those costs moving forward, we've implemented a cafeteria health plan. We did that just a couple of years ago. We eliminated retiree health care. We increased our contributions toward OPEB. We contract for services where feasible. And as Councilmember Whitmer pointed out, we will be considering for the Finance Committee, our committee member Polito's got some expertise in this area, will provide some great feedback to pay off of the workers' compensation negative equity that we have, and that's another number we can use OPEB to pay down. I'm sorry. So the budget document format, I am not going to talk about these things. They're within the staff report, but that's where we're talking about fund accounting, what a general fund is, what a special fund is, what a capital project fund is, and how our accounting systems work. So when you get your budget, you can actually understand what a lot of that stuff's talking about. The public gets it as well. So So you have the budget calendar in the staff report, April 15th. We're going to be talking about the operations budget. That's general fund operations. We're not going to be digging into the master or the capital projects until May 6th. May 6th, we hit the capital improvement budget. You've got a workshop. You're going to be with us all day long. We will meet you. We just won't pay you. But you'll be with us all day long to talk about goals and vision, and may even include library services. But you'll certainly want to talk about some capital projects that you want done in town that will feed into that evening's discussion on May 6th as well. Budget study session on June 6th, that's everything. So you'll have had this information for a month to a month and a half. On the June 6th meeting, that's where it's going to be, could be rather long. More
Is
than
that
2
going
hours.
to include assessment of parcel tax for this coming year?
That will be part of the June 6th meeting and the actual adoption on June 17th, whether you will allocate it to 20, whether you want to reduce it, whether you want to change it, modify it, whatever. And the Finance Committee will have input into the parcel tax conversation as well as that workers' comp allocation. So some of their recommendations will feed forward as we go. So this is the last slide. It's a summary and forecast. So you got the major revenue of 10.1. This is fiscal year 15-16. Other revenue of about $2 million, total 12.1. You take off the salaries and benefits, your OPEX costs, your OPEB, and your CalPERS, unfunded actuarial liability contributions, and then you get our over and under number. And notice that's all red and zero, or below zero. So you have to add back in our 20% parcel tax that goes to the general fund in support of the police services. That's $372,000. And then you add in ERAF, estimated ERAF at $700K, and that's the net that goes to our fund balance at the bottom. So looking forward, there is a need for additional revenue sources for the town. We don't like that negative number when we have all of our expenditures. So reducing costs where possible, finding additional revenue where possible is still a good thing. The parcel tax is still a need. Whether it's 20% or 30% of the general fund is something we need to talk about or more. And whether or not we want to continue to not be dependent upon ERAF. I would prefer that we not be dependent upon it. So if we have an operational budget that is zero, that's great. And then we can use ERAF for other things, capital projects, one-time capital projects, or long-term liabilities.
So the reason we don't have anything that we'll have in 16, 17 is because we will have completely funded it.
No, we,
Up to 5 million is what
up to
our-
5 million,
our
which is
target
about the
is.
90% range,
Is what we decided.
is what we talked about as a target.
But we still have the liabilities. We still have the liabilities.
You still have some liability there, you still have unfunded actuarial liability for CalPERS, which is the other number, which you could contribute toward, and you also have, as we talked about earlier, that negative equity on workers' comp we can pay off, which would reduce our OPEX expenses by $100,000 each year.
Because essentially the ERAF and the other thing, like, headed in some sense.
Exactly. So I think that was the last slide, and like I said, this is an overview, and take that with you, call with any questions, happy to talk about things in detail as we move forward into the budget process, and you'll get a lot more detail as we start talking about the operational budget, we got improvement budget.
It seems like the donor city fund should do that, ERAF.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I mean,
But that's good.
Yeah, but you remember, the ERAF is managed at a
Well,
higher
yeah, I mean,
level.
we can
But they
have
want to
it-
manage it at a higher level, they may say they'll give it back to us after they spend it all.
yeah, we have to keep the state from taking it.
Right, and that's the concern with ERAF, is that could eventually go away, and so that's why we want to keep it, not as an operational
Right.
aspect, but as we continue to receive it, allocate it towards one-time things like OPEB, unfunded liabilities, capital projects, for that, as we have that revenue source. We're not counting on it for operations, so if it goes away, hey, we took care of other things in the meantime, right?
So, one other thing, so when are we gonna talk about our priorities for spending some of our, allocating?
You have a goals workshop on May 6th,
That's
that would be the time to do that.
On the,
You can see it.
okay, because, looking at our, the open gov, town hall,
Yeah.
thing, so there were 30 responses, 18 of them all said townwide fiber. 9 of them went drainage, solutions. Traffic is like, 14, grade separations, so those are, that's feedback we're getting from our residents, and we need to kind of look at that. But town townwide fiber? That's an idea whose time is coming.
I think we should do that. What do you think?
Have we been working on that?
Okay, so if I, the last slide that you showed, if I understand this, we could increase the allocation from the parcel tax from 20 to 40%, move ERAF to CIP, and that would then not depend on ERAF, it would depend on the parcel tax to balance the budget. Of course, there's other things we could do to enhance revenue, but that may mean we don't need 40% of parcel tax to balance the budget. But if I'm looking at it right now, there, I mean, maybe it's 60% there, we can increase the parcel tax on them. No, if we increase parcel tax by from 20 to 40% and remove DRAP, then we'd end up with a net balance of about zero.
Yep. And the goal is to balance it out.
I
It
understand.
was 60.
But remember, the ERAF
It was
was,
64, this is,
yeah,
go back to that.
the ERAF was understated here.
Yeah.
That would just
Yeah.
be pushing more into CIP from ERAP,
But also,
or some other use.
but also remember, that the ERAF payment that hopefully we'll make this year, and to maybe taking care of the, as was suggested in the staff report, the workman's comp, as well as finish our payment into the OPEB to get it down. Then that saves $100,000, and then if we start servicing some of the CalPERS stuff, that would also. So there is some
There's
extra
a lot
money
of
in there that's
savings.
not there.
There's a lot of
Right,
savings in
yeah.
going forward, in taking care of some of this.
So each of you will be.
I have a motion to adjourn.
Wait a minute, it's only 10 minutes out, we got another.
Still got time, you got 8 minutes.
I gotta be prepared, but
There's,
he only has that.
you should each receive contact from Nancy Hedrick from Management Partners
Yeah.
to have a little one-on-one dialogue with you about the goals workshop. And what she wants to hear from you is exactly what your priorities are for the workshop, what some of your thoughts are for the town moving forward. And she'll help feed that agenda for the May 6th workshop. So if everybody talks about the library, that one's looking to be on the agenda. So that's what she's looking for, is that sort of feedback from each of you, is to help build her agenda to facilitate that workshop.
I was thinking.
And then also the open town hall stuff, feeding her as well.
Yeah, so
Not on the agenda.
will staff be aggregating the open town hall information for the goals workshop? I think that'd be
Yes,
very
yes, we will. And it'll be Teresa and I and Nancy and then all of you, and of course, Bill.
We will come together.
Yeah, well, we have a meeting in April.
I know.
I don't know how much time. Is there any public comment?
I don't have to worry about those.
Okay.
The adjourn.
No